You're listening to the Roovolution Podcast. Join us as we bust myths and challenge common assumptions, helping you to revolutionize your rooster experience. So, we've talked a lot about the detrimental effects of the more combative methods often suggested to deal with undesirable rooster behavior, but today we'd like to look at some common alternative methods that appear to be gentle on the surface, but actually lead to just as many issues. And that's kind of because ultimately the cause of the behavior still isn't being identified, right?
Right, exactly. It's an easy trap to fall into, really, because we take a huge step forward when we recognize that violence begets violence, and we drop the combative methods and stop fighting our boys. But it can feel like all we need to do is just not be rough with them and they won't be rough with us. But it really comes down to a shift in perspective, truly getting to the bottom of most of these issues. Because even if we're being gentle, we still have a huge language barrier to deal with. And so this is something we see come up all the time, where various methods that seem very non-combative wind up sending really bad messages, worsening things, shaking up the flock dynamic in a way that leads to additional problems. And it really seems to come down to kind of a foundation of dismissiveness. In most cases, when a person is dealing with any kind of undesirable behavior, at least in most communities, the initial response to that and the initial recommendations are going to be geared just to force a stop to it. I don't really think that people are trying to neglect the bird's feelings, not consciously anyway, but there seems to be sort of a stigma that all it is just something that's inconvenient to the human and there's no harm in stopping it, and as long as we can just put up these barricades, that's all that's required. So we get into, things like, for instance, using a laundry basket. If you need to go into the run to do chores and you're dealing with attacks, just putting a laundry basket upside down over the rooster to stop him from attacking. So something like that does achieve the goal of keeping the human from being targeted, but it's putting a lot of negativity into the situation in the way that it's being done. Not only is it failing to actually address what's causing the rooster to attack, what's making him fearful in the first place, but it's actually introducing even more stress and even more of an association with threat from the human. Chickens are prey animals. They have to defend against aerial predators all the time. They have a very, very hardwired panic response and aversion to things coming in above their head. So just the act of putting that basket on him is going to be triggering that threat response because of something that is hardwired in his brain, and it's going to wind up associated with us.
Yeah, I'd say regardless of the sort of resulting response to having the basket put over him, it's doing something detrimental. There's some negative association, even if he doesn't freak out or, necessarily attack immediately, after you remove it. But every bird is different, like we said in, pretty much every episode. Every bird is different, and some will tolerate things better than others. Some will, let things slide easier than others. Our boy Daisy, we found out, does not accept or deal with well being put in a confined small space. We were trying to break up some conflict last year by using a large dog kennel and put Daisy in there to separate him from the other boys, and he just freaked out. He started jumping up and hitting his head on the ceiling of that dog kennel, potentially injuring himself, and had to take him out immediately because that was not going to work.
Yeah, we wound up partitioning off an area that included the coop and really essentially just using a dog kennel as a wall in a rather MacGyvered fashion. But you just never know. And even if he doesn't freak out about it, there's still so many disruptions to the social dynamic there that aren't apparent if we're just coming at it from the perspective of how do I prevent myself from having to deal with this annoyance. For instance, if we really break it down to what's going through that bird's head when he does this, he is attacking in response to a perceived threat. So yes, we can put something on him to keep him from physically being able to move or access us. But psychologically speaking, what we're doing in his mind, we're separating him from his girls. We're making him helpless. He still believes there's a threat because we haven't addressed the feeling that there's a threat. So now he's just trapped. He's helpless. The girls are without protection. Something has come in, triggering that predator response in his head, almost certainly, even if he doesn't respond horribly to this. So all of this put together is putting him in a situation that to him feels incredibly negative, incredibly desperate, and worse yet, we initiated it. So all of that is getting lumped into his experience with us. It may keep us from getting kicked in that moment, but the damage is so pervasive when we do things like this, because oftentimes we really aren't accounting for what that is saying to them, what experience it's giving them, what conclusions they're drawing as a result of it, and the kind of insecurity that a rooster is going to develop when he feels like when he needs to defend his flock, something is going to come and trap him and keep him from doing so is just completely devastating. The more this is done, the more his confidence is going to suffer, the more reactive he's going to become, the more he's going to try to overcompensate to keep that from happening. So it really can worsen that attack response. And of course, a person can continue just going in and putting that basket on him every day. But the problem is that those kinds of anxieties come out in other ways. It's not only going to be directed at us. He's going to start getting heavy-handed potentially with his girls because he's so insecure about his ability to keep them safe. So anytime that there's this mental disturbance within any flock member, there is a danger of that being expressed towards other flock members.
Right. And this applies to other things, than just using a laundry basket to, contain him and prevent that kicking and flogging. Forced holding, I think, falls into the same category. That's another one that is so often recommended as a gentle alternative because, how could that be anything bad if you're just holding them, showing them you're safe, and, providing them affection in a stressful situation? That seems like it would be only good. But again, if you're not addressing the cause of the issue and you're just picking them up and restraining them, and they feel like the issue is still there. I mean, what if the issue is your shirt, that particular shirt you're wearing, and then you pick them up and, force cuddle them, and they're now right next to your shirt and like freaking out. Right.
And this one comes up all the time because it's not only a really, really common recommendation, but it is easy to fall into, again, kind of this trap of feeling like, well, we know better, and if we just force them to do it enough, they'll come around. And it's even more insidious because they often seem to come around, but there's an enormous difference between coming around by choice out of trust and coming around by defeat. We absolutely can condition a bird that they have no hope of doing anything about it, and there's no point in resisting, and they're just helpless. And that really isn't the relationship we want to have with them. It's so much better to address the concern and to respect that concern, more importantly. So again, when we really take a step back and we break all of this down, what's at the root of it is an assumption that we are the smarter party, that they're being irrational, and that we just need to force them to see things our way. And again, that really isn't what people are doing, I don't think, when they use these methods. It's just something that doesn't even really get thought about. And this is why it's important to kind of take a step back and broaden perspectives and start to try to transition into seeing these undesirable or inconvenient behaviors as something entirely legitimate. They're not something to just stifle or suppress. They're something to honor and listen to and respond to compassionately, because that's what's going to actually resolve them. And this is really how it goes with any species. I mean, even with humans, if we want to have a legitimate friendship with somebody, the first thing that needs to be in place is trust. And trust is generated by a consistent track record of caring and responding empathetically to that person's cues, to their insecurities, to their discomforts. We're never going to establish a friendship with any species by treating their feelings and their worries as though they're irrelevant. So in very rare cases, just kind of as a disclaimer, certain birds may just be very wound up, and they may actually appreciate, being scooped up out of a situation and reassured. But the problem is that most often this is recommended as a solution for birds who do not want to be held. They don't want to get close, and they're responding fearfully when they're approached. And so the issue here is that, again, that is a legitimate fear on their part, and holding is basically capture, the one thing that a prey animal wants most to avoid. So when we do this, it's critical to actually understand and, again, respect how this bird feels about that interaction. And if what we're doing is just forcing them to tolerate something that they hate, that's terrifying to them, that is going to create aversion. It's going to cause them to associate us with that negative experience. And there are going to be much, much better ways to go about it. And they are ultimately going to come down to giving the benefit of the doubt that the bird is responding to a legitimate fear, a legitimate stimulus, and finding ways to reassure and to convey that they don't need to be afraid. So in most of these cases, the reason they're running away from us is because they're afraid we're going to capture them. And forced holding is, of course, just affirming to them that that is exactly what's going to happen. So this is the reason, really for looking deeper into these things. And we do sometimes know better, but that doesn't mean their experience is not valid, not worth taking seriously, because it's just as real to them as our view of the situation is to us. It's not really a question of who's right and who's wrong. And that seems to be, in most cases, we default to thinking that our perception of things is the correct one and that they just need to kind of fall in line. And really, most of the recommendations I've come across for just about anything that are broadly suggested come from that same perspective of we're right and they just need to see the light and just kind of like beating on a TV, that's out of focus to try to fix it. It's just this very heavy-handed approach that doesn't account for the nuances or the finer workings that underlie the issue. And we may even go into, some information in a future episode on specifically how to go about getting a rooster to be comfortable with being close in a way that doesn't reinforce that fear and that aversion. Let us know if that's something that would be helpful to you. A lot of people seem to encounter that issue where they just can't get close enough to their bird to treat them or secure them. And that is a legitimate problem. It is something that needs to be accounted for, but we can work with them to get there instead of against them.
Definitely. This makes me think of a couple other examples we have on here and sort of a lead into them, crow collars and pinless peepers, things like that are often thought as harmless, but ultimately are just inconsiderate of the animal and communicate something to the animal when we put that restrictive device on them. It makes me think back to my childhood. We actually had adopted a couple dogs. They were 6 or 7 years old, two sisters, and one of the previous owners had debarked her. They had surgically modified the vocal cords so that she couldn't bark because she had barked too much and people were complaining. And so that was their solution, instead of taking her to training classes to deal with the issue that is causing the incessant barking. But so my entire childhood we had that dog, and she would try and bark a lot, but she didn't make much sound at all, just a muffled and it was extremely sad to see for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, and that falls into these like masking kinds of strategies, where the aim is just to make it less abrasive, make whatever's going on not an inconvenience again, to the human caregivers, but often neglecting what's actually being communicated with that, because often it is a sign of some deeper problem that does need addressing.
And things like debarking a dog or, declawing a cat, which used to be done so much more commonly, just aren't done anymore by veterinarians because it is clearly, agreed upon that it's unethical or inhumane to do so. And I'm sure you can imagine, how much that would affect a dog, their ability to communicate with other dogs in the neighborhood or dogs in their family or their humans who they're trying to alert to something. Like that could cause a whole lot of unnecessary stress on top of, just a normal day. And it's not any different with roosters. When you use something like a crow collar and restrict their ability to communicate that way, communicate to their hens, to, come back for dinner or to come in for roost or any number of things. Our roosters communicate with us with their crows, and just restricting a being's ability to communicate what they feel they need to communicate is a huge stressor and a huge cause of, what we would often see as undesirable behavior. So the thing that's thought to be more humane, is really just making matters worse.
Right. And to be fair, a lot of times when I see people opting for that option with the crow collars, it's because it's the only way they can see to keep those boys at home if they happen to live somewhere, with noise ordinances or things like this, although there really are quite a few alternatives to something like that. And I mean, it strikes me that it's kind of like, we've all probably had the experience where we're having a nightmare and we try to scream for help and no sound comes out. A rooster's crow is a way of alerting to a problem or trying to identify the location of other flock members. And something like a crow collar that's going to restrict their ability to do that has to feel very much like that same stress and helplessness that we might have in the midst of a nightmare where, the killer has just broken into the room and we scream and it's silent or near silent. And we know that we can't make enough noise to get the attention of anyone we need to come help us. So again, if you put yourself in the rooster's perspective here, that's a really horrible situation. It's going to keep them on edge, and it's going to make them feel like they can't do their job. And of course, for roosters, attacks happen when a rooster feels like he can't do his job. Just that anxiety and that insecurity that it creates can have really serious impacts on pretty much all of his interactions.
Well, it kind of put him on a hair trigger, at all times.
Yeah, exactly. He's going to be upset if the hens get too far. He's going to be probably very prone to exhibiting a lot of abnormal behaviors as a response to that. And that's not even to mention the physical dangers, of something like a crow collar. Many think that they're completely safe and humane, but I've heard a number of cases of birds choking to death when they try to swallow something just a little bit too large and their throat can't expand enough. Also, as they grow, if these are put on young, and don't get adjusted correctly. Basically, if they're left loose enough to be actually safe, they don't do much of anything, if anything at all, to reduce volume. To reduce the volume, they have to be tight enough to be basically strangling when they try to expand their neck. And so if they never happen to get anything like a mouse, and try to swallow it, that might wind up being all right. But this also, the crowing is something that they can't always really seem to help. It's a bit like a yawn in certain situations. So, you can kind of just imagine every time you need to yawn, someone's got their hands around your neck. Just going to be a very unpleasant experience for them all the way around. And the pinless peepers, very much the same thing. That's so often used to address issues like feather picking or bullying, which again are a red flag that something is going on in the flock. There is some disturbance, there's some problem or dispute or nutritional deficiency in the case of feather nipping. And the solution isn't isn't just to stop them from being able to tell us about it, which really is essentially what the pinless peepers are doing. They're making it easier for us, and they're reducing our stress by not having to see or remember that behavior problem, but the birds still need whatever help they needed before those were put on. The problem that prompted the behavior before they were put on still exists because nothing has been done about it. The pinless peepers also have been known to wear a hole through essentially the septum area of their beak in between their nostrils. They're supposed to be, again, a humane alternative to pinned peepers, which are a variant that actually do pierce the septum and latch in place on the other side. The pinless ones are just pegs, and they're supposed to not have that problem. But I have seen photographic evidence of holes, worn through the nose after use of these, not even for an incredibly long duration. So basically, in trying to avoid the brutality of piercing that area, what we can wind up doing is causing the same exact damage, only through very, very slow and gradual wear, just eroding that all day, every day until it punctures through. So far from being, a humane or a gentle option, and really that huge danger of masking some serious problem within the flock that actually does need our attention. Again, always best to fall back and try to actually look for what's being said, and to be aware that they are telling us something legitimate with these behaviors. It's not just for no reason. They're not just trying to be annoying or inconvenient or make us pull out our hair. There is always a very important thing that's being communicated.
Definitely. I mean, that's a good lead in, I think, to the next example we have, the common recommendation, and which often leads to just masking a particular problem, and that's, timeouts. Either short or long duration timeouts in a confined space. I'd see most often recommended a dog kennel, which, I think has its place. It can be used strategically or properly, but it's a really fine line. And like with everything, revolving around roosters, there's nuance to it, right?
Definitely. And this one is actually really fascinating because it's one of those that it really does make sense at first glance, because, we can speak from experience that our roosters use timeouts to correct flock members and to enforce rules. Our head roo currently will always run any offending bird to the top roost of the coop, and then the moment that they're up there, he'll walk away, and it's fine as long as they hang out there, and if they come back down, he'll often run them back. And it really does seem to be his way of enforcing that they've done something out of line and they need to, sit and think about it, demonstrate that they're willing to stop doing it, something. And so when you see something like that, you might think, okay, well, it makes sense for me to do the same thing they're doing. And it'll be something that they understand and it'll communicate what I want. But the issue here is that something like timeouts, regardless of the species that you're dealing with, whether animals, companion animals, livestock animals, humans, it all comes down to conditioning. And conditioning is dependent on consistency. So you're not going to condition what you want to see change if you're only doing this, say, 5% of the time. So, for instance, if you put your rooster in timeout because he was being too rough with a hen and while you were out there and you saw him, let's say you stick him in timeout for 15-20 minutes and then you let him back out to have another try, that is not going to connect as cause and effect for him if the other, 95% of the time that he does this, you're not present to see it and nothing happens. So we've got one issue there of just our frequent absences. We cannot possibly reliably catch every time that they do this and have the effect be the same every time. So they wind up getting away with it, often the majority of the time, and we just wind up looking like an irrational jerk when we suddenly stick them in the kennel 1 out of 30 times that it happens.
On top of that, even if you could catch every single instance and address it then, you would still be potentially sending a message you don't want to send. It's just so hard to accurately and reliably interpret everything that's going on that caused that situation. And if we, for example, put the wrong bird, we think the offender, and he's not. If we put the wrong bird in timeout, that can disrupt the pecking order. It can cause more conflicts in the following days, leading to injury or worse.
Right. Well, and I think we've talked about this last episode or the episode before, that often the higher up who does the scolding, which can look like bullying to us, is responding to a very, very subtle cue or misbehavior from a lower bird in the flock. So it makes perfect sense that it's going to look to us like nothing happened and they're doing it for no reason. But really, it's just that it's very hard for us to note those subtleties and those nuances in their communication. And often the first thing that's going to catch our attention is the scolding. It's going to be the bird who's reprimanding or punishing, because that's just bigger, it's more noticeable, and it's much easier to recognize what's happening there. So we've seen this so many times in our flock. I mean, 2 of our boys just this morning stood for probably 2 entire minutes, literally just face to face, just staring at each other, not moving, motionless, and then just walked away as though nothing had happened. We know that their interactions are complex enough that we would never in a million years assume that nothing was going on there. But we're certain that whatever was going on was so subtle, so complex, probably down to simple pupil dilations and constrictions, that there is absolutely no way we could decipher that. It's just kind of a mystery to us, but it's clear. It's clear that something was communicated there, something was being done, and it's entirely possible in moments like that someone causes offense by some pupil motion or slight tilt of their head, and next thing you know, someone's getting chased. So it is even a greater danger if you happen to have, say, a lower boy who's getting out of line, but he's doing this in a way that's very hard to note, that really only another chicken is going to understand. And a higher boy scolds him for it, and then that higher boy gets removed and penned for being, potentially a bully. That's going to prolong this issue because the higher up boy has been thwarted in enforcing the order that he needs to enforce now, and the lower boy has seen this happen, and he has learned now that if he acts out, if he does something against the rules, he'll be defended by the humans. The higher boy is going to be trapped and taken out of the situation, and that is predictably going to embolden him to push those boundaries further, to be more confident in acting out. And next thing you know, you've got a lot more chaos and disruption in the flock, simply because the enforcers aren't being permitted to do their job. We're just misinterpreting what's actually happening, what's being responded to. And really the same thing goes for, things like forcefully resetting the pecking order. That's something that's often kind of a go-to recommendation anytime that there's conflict or discord, in the flock, or somebody's just sort of acting impolitely towards someone else. It's always just pull them, separate them for a couple of weeks, and then bring them back, which again, is kind of coming from this assumption that if they're acting a way that we don't like or that is inconvenient for us, they're just being difficult or problematic and just need to be forcibly stopped. So many things can be driving this, and taking a bird out of the flock is a huge disruption to that social order. So you can very easily wind up taking a bird who was actually doing a really good job in their position, forcing them out, bringing them back in lower, and allowing a bird who maybe isn't as well qualified to take over in their position. Now you've got new and different problems. And again, the initial problem that was causing the conflict to begin with hasn't been resolved. So it's almost like just going in and just shaking things up more or less at random to just see if it fixes it.
Yeah, just practically speaking, I think it's not a very efficient way to go about things. It seems like a quicker and easier solution in the short term. You're going to see that peace in the flock for however long you have that boy separated, but I can almost guarantee you're going to run into problems as soon as you try and reintegrate, and probably worsen problems.
Yeah, absolutely, especially with roosters because they have such an extreme way of stabilizing and establishing that pecking order. Even with hens, you're going to have stress and discordance and, hoops to jump through with getting them back in there. But in so many cases, there is a real problem, like in feather picking, for instance. It can be the result of low protein. It can be the result of boredom. It can even be the result of parasites, if they're like picking themselves. So just
or something psychological, like
true.
Anxiety or paranoia.
Right. Or illness. Sometimes the reason they're harassing or bullying another flock member is because they're sick, So it can be actually really dangerous to just sort of slap on blinders and call it good because it blinds us to what's really going on, and that is going to prevent us from fixing it. And it may be a minor thing. It may just be kind of a behavioral nervous tick that doesn't result in anything terribly severe if we just stop them, but it could be something very serious. And even with just stopping those nervous ticks, we are impeding their ability to function as a chicken. We're impeding their vision, their ability to watch for predators, just so many things that come along with that and can generate brand new problems that weren't even present before. So when it comes to any kind of flock conflict, the goal should always be to let them deal with these things, let them do what they need to do as much as possible, and see what they're doing as evidence, as clues, essentially, to what's going on and how we can support the best possible dynamic with the least possible disruption.
Keyword there is watch them, watch them to see what they do. Observing your flock has got to be, the biggest thing you can do to help yourself, help them. Any time of day, if I just sit there and watch them for even 20 minutes is enough. But if you can watch them for an hour, like you'll see them do so much. Like it's so telling, what the flock dynamic is when you give them enough time to show you their routines. It's hard to get to know somebody in just a 5 or even 10 minute, short span of time. But if you pay enough attention for a little bit longer, you can see a lot that gives you, much more information to use to your advantage.
Yeah, it really gets to the point that you're not having to sit there and try to really, analyze anymore. You're not having to make guesses. You can get to the point, really, that it feels almost like you can sort of read their mind, like just you can sense where they're at and what they're upset about and what they're reacting to. And it becomes actually very, very quick and very easy to provide what they need. But truly, just watching their interactions, taking note of their norms, their vocalizations when they're feeling energetic and happy versus when they're feeling stressed or worn out. Right now in our flock of hens, we've got a few who have just finished up, or in the middle of a very hard molt. One of those girls, Midnight, tends really not to want anyone around her. She's sort of an island. She likes to be a bit of a loner, just seems to find the other flock members a bit annoying, honestly. Particularly her sister, who tends to be a bit reactive and high-strung. And as soon as her sister Petra started this very hard molt and started feeling crummy and wanting to just lie around and kind of feel sorry for herself, all of a sudden they're kind of snuggling up together in the corner, feeling sorry for themselves together. And most interestingly, a third girl, Topaz, who both of them really don't spend much time around, and Midnight in particular never wants to be around. As soon as she started that hard molt and started getting mopey, all of a sudden they're letting her come over and snuggle with them. I've been joking that it's their little pity party that they've been having every day. But, to watch them, you would think that she was just nasty to Topaz, but it's really not that. It's that there's an energy mismatch and there's an attitude mismatch, under most circumstances. And as soon as that lines up and as soon as they're sort of more on the same track and wavelength, all of that can completely shift. So a lot of these things that we see as just them being nasty or singling someone out, it can be some very subtle things going on, and it can be honestly fairly simple to sort through that, just again by affording the right support. So if you have some boys who are kind of a mismatch, one of them just likes to crowd the other, perhaps, and the one who is being crowded doesn't appreciate this and conflict breaks out, simple things like providing more roosts, in their area, places they can get up off the ground, giving them hiding spots if they need a break, because just like us, sometimes they're just really not up for interaction and they just need a timeout. Not the kind where we're putting them in a kennel, but the kind where they can go somewhere peaceful and recover and sort of be left alone for a little bit. So considering that those emotions exist, that they have their friendly, active days and their days where they're just not feeling it, and making sure that their environment and interactions accommodate that can do such good for interaction overall. Providing visual barriers, for if they're having days where they're just sort of not getting along, providing additional feeders and waters so they are not feeling like they have to compete over those resources, adding more girls sometimes if roosters are having difficulty getting along in a mixed flock. Hens are resources too, as is space. So when we see that they're reacting badly towards one another, they're lashing out at each other, it's just like it is with humans when we're having a bad day. There is always something else behind it. It's never that they just woke up and decided to be nasty that day. They're struggling to cope with something is taxing them and putting them on edge, and as soon as we identify and correct that, things tend to go back to very peaceful very quickly.
I think this is a good point to mention. The other thing we have on our list that a lot of people deal with is broody behavior and the recommendations often given to deal with that.
Definitely. This one was one that we kind of had to wing it, no pun intended, with our first girl who did this, because if you've looked at all into broody hens, you've probably seen that there's very few recommendations to deal with this that don't involve something fairly unpleasant for the broody hen. Most often you'll see a recommendation to, stick a frozen water bottle under them, or, stick them in a kennel suspended in the air so that they're just on the wire floor with nothing but food and water there with them. And the idea behind this, again, is just as logically sound. Cooling down their belly can help derail that process. Putting them somewhere they can't get to the nest box at least forces them not to reinforce that drive and that behavior. But once again, there's sort of a disregard for the really strong urge that girl is going through, and for the really, really difficult situation that we put them in when we try to just essentially trap them and stop them from acting on their natural instincts. So when we first found that one of our girls, Topaz, was starting to go broody, we weren't entirely sure what to do. We knew that we couldn't bring ourselves to just stick her in a kennel with nothing to do and trapped and unable to go to her nest. But she's not housed with a rooster, and we also knew that for health and safety reasons, she was not going to be able to continue this. And so, sort of out of desperation and on a whim, we wound up bringing her into the house for the day. Just figured it would prevent her from going to the box in a way that might afford her some enjoyment and wouldn't mean that she had to just sit there doing nothing in a confined space all day. And our house is all tile, so even if she did plop down on the floor somewhere, it was going to be nice and cool and not cozy and insulated. But she had an absolute blast. She seemed to have a delightful time, and we took her back out just after dark to make sure that she wouldn't just jump from the roost and go into the nest box to sleep. We made sure that it was low enough light that she wouldn't be able to navigate back to the box, and sure enough, the next morning she was completely back to normal behavior. So things like that work because it's not just a physical knee jerk that they're having when they do this sort of thing. There is that instinct, that's true, but there is a mind behind this too. And so when you have something like a hen who's being kept in just a suspended kennel in the run who can't get back to her nest, that may address part of it, but her mind is still on that effort. She's got now nothing to do but sit there fuming and dwelling on the idea. And it does tend to take quite a long time of that to break them, which I'm sure is miserable for them and really isn't the most considerate approach. So what I suspect makes the house method so effective is the fact that it not only prevents them from continuing like we want to do, but it does so in a way that accounts for their state of mind, gives them something else to focus on, and distracts them from that effort with positive things enough that it can kind of loosen its grip on them. We had joked, that coming inside and getting all those treats and special attention kind of disillusioned her, and she went, you know what, motherhood is overrated. I'm going to stick with this, which I'm sure isn't the case. We would catch her early, and we would make sure that she didn't really get herself into that rut. Although, I will say that I've heard reports from actually another keeper who's used the same method after all the other ones failed to break her girl, meaning that she had been at this a while, and same thing, within just a day of her coming inside, she stopped. So, it's not a rooster example, but it is a really good example of how much recognizing the mind behind the machine, the mind behind the behavior, is crucial for having a smooth path forward when it comes to problem solving. If all we're doing is working on that external, the environmental, and just putting up roadblocks, there's going to be a really serious cap to how far we can go with those solutions to these problems. If we're not addressing the thought process and the psychology and the experience of the bird we're working with, we're going to run into not just obstacles, but we're going to have a pretty randomized slew of new problems come up because we're essentially messing with things that we really don't fully understand when we do this.
I think the only thing left on our list to talk about really is the suggestion I've seen much more frequently, much more recently. I hadn't seen this a couple of years ago, but I feel like in the last, 6 months or so, it's popped up many, many times. And that is mimicking flaring, often with an umbrella, to discourage a rooster from attacking. And, I can see where people are going with that. It looks like a rooster flaring his neck feathers, his hackle feathers, right? But at the same time, I think a rooster knows the difference between the object in your hand and you. And so kind of, what are we communicating with the opening of an umbrella at a rooster? I don't think it's that we are a rooster, fear me. It's more of like, I'm a human with this crazy big object that gets, big suddenly, and, fear me for that.
It is solely intimidation. There's just no way. I'm chuckling over here because there's no way that roosters are so unintelligent that they think we've just become a giant rooster when we do this. Not only do their neck feathers flare the opposite direction away from their head at their neck, not in front of their face or chest, but we were just standing there, the human they recognized with, a collapsed object in our hand that suddenly got big. They know exactly what's going on. Of course, they're frightened by this. But again, it falls exactly into that category of, intimidation, domination, and that it enforces to them that we are a threat. And of course, in some cases, a rooster might at least temporarily be intimidated enough by something like this to give us a wide berth. But at the end of the day, roosters attack things they feel threatened by, and they will not remain as threatened forever. They will become more used to that experience, more conditioned, more bold. They'll fall back and regroup and brainstorm and think of a better strategy for dealing with us. The one thing that does remain constant is that every time we do these things, we are communicating to them that we are absolutely a danger, we are something frightening, and that is going to make them so much more likely to try to attack us. Anything that seeks to scare or upset them is going to have that impact.
Even if it did trick them and made them think that you're this giant rooster who's flaring up at them, it's only going to communicate that you're a competitor and that they do have someone to fear or defend against, and you've just made yourself a giant rooster that they're going to want to fight every day.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it falls into, kind of the same category as like the spraying with a hose or a water bottle. That's another one that at first glance on the surface, it's not hurting them. But this is kind of the bad perception here, the mistaken evaluation when we're only considering, is it hurting them or not? Because there are plenty of things that don't physically hurt an individual that are very emotionally or psychologically damaging. So anytime that we use things like that, if we're spraying them for bad behavior, yes, they may learn that if they do that behavior, something unpleasant happens. But again, it's happening at our hands, and they are smart enough to know this. Mm-hmm. So they're going to develop that same kind of aversion, that same kind of threat response, that same kind of fear and insecurity around us. And even if they go time, without attacking, they're kind of towing that line now. They're on the brink of feeling like we require a violent or aggressive response. And heaven forbid we have to do something like pick up a hen to help her with something wrapped around her head or beak one day. Something like that, just a past history of water being sprayed at him and not trusting our intentions, could quite literally be the difference between him trusting us in that interaction or launching off with a complete and total attack.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, is that, there are just consequences down the road that we don't always account for that would be so much easier to avoid, if we just went about it differently from the beginning. Like you said, if you ever needed to get a hen, for treatment, or even the rooster, it's like, if you've ever sprayed them or, done any of these more gentle methods to correct their behavior, I don't think that they're going to result in a chicken that is going to be willing to or excited about coming close to you or even jumping up on your lap, being restrained and cooperative about it. I think any of these methods are going to lead to a bird that is still, suspicious of you or, distrusting of you a little bit. And I don't think any of these methods are going to lead to a bird that wants to jump up on your lap. And I know that's not the goal for everybody, but if it were, it would enable any keeper to, like we said, easily pick up any bird, rooster or hen, to treat them for something medical. It's just, anytime you do these other methods that, tints their vision of you negatively, you're not getting the most out of the experience that you could or they could. It's really closing a door to something much more enjoyable and easy and efficient, really. Even if you're going for efficiency, even if these are livestock animals, your problems would be fewer, the solutions would be easier if you interact with them in a way that makes them trust you instead of distrust you.
Yeah, and that really is the irony, because so often when you see these discussions taking place, it's clear that there's a concern on the human side over who's in charge and who's in control. And it makes sense, that we feel like we are the, superior animal. We're certainly the ones, paying the bills and calling the shots and managing care. But ironically, the less we try to be in control and enforce our position of power and authority, the less we find ourselves needing to do that. We've laughed about this before because it's so common to hear, that they need to know you're in charge and they need to respect you and they need to dominate you. That was, I think, our first episode was this issue with respecting, their keeper and where those problems are with that. But it's one of those things where we set out on this sort of letting them call all of the shots and really never worrying too much about this. And 99% probably of the community would tell us that we would have completely unmanageable aggressive birds at this point. And if you've seen any of our, videos of the flock, that couldn't be farther from the truth. But it's very much a situation in our household that they call the shots in most cases. We coordinate our day around their comfort, their preferences. We make a point to stick to a schedule so they know that they can expect us at a certain time every day. If they want to come out and have yard time, we let them out and we stand there and we supervise them. pretty much everything. If they ask for certain treats, we go pick those for them. They do stay pens, so they require a lot of response from us. But it's definitely not a situation of having to have them mind us, and the level of cooperation we see from them is just staggering. We don't have to herd them back into their run when they come out into the yard. We step into the run and we say, "Come on, boys," and they come running. If we need to take them somewhere and treat them, we scoop them up and we go and we do it. If I need to clean something off of their face, I tell them help, gentle, and they freeze and they hold still and they let me do it. So interestingly, it seems that the roosters themselves really aren't too concerned about who's in control, actually. They're much more concerned about cooperation and mutual consideration. I've seen no efforts from our boys to try to herd us, to try to dominate us, to try to reprimand us, even. They behave still actually like little chicks, despite having been given the reins and every opportunity to exert authority over us if they wanted to. But they do that with each other, but when it comes to us, it's like they revert back to being, 3 weeks old and just completely gentle and harmless.
Yeah, we are really... not a chicken in their eyes. A lot of people use these methods and, insist that you need to be head of the flock. You need to be the dominant one, right? But you can put yourself outside of that pecking order, outside of that sort of idea in their head. We can be a different species. They do see us as a different species, and if we are mama and papa, that's fine. Or if we're just caretakers or friends, that's fine too. But you can manage all of this without putting yourself in that competitive space.
Yeah. I mean, they don't really go there naturally. They might with another rooster, an actual other rooster, but they don't think that's what we are unless we take actions that try to purposefully communicate to them that we are. That's where things get really muddy. And, we've mentioned before that we're pretty radical, on the pet keeping side in terms of how we care for them, how we interact with them, the amount of time we spend with them. But it's not just out of emotional sensitivity. It's certainly partly that. We're the sort that if we come out and find the cat has stolen our chair, we'll crouch it on the floor, to use the computer keyboard and mouse and let them keep it. So it was pretty natural for us to put their feelings and preferences ahead of ours. But it has simplified so many things, because what we're left with is birds who would never resist us, would never fight back against anything we do, would never even be uncooperative, because their entire lives, their feelings and their needs and their concerns have always been prioritized. So the strange thing comes about when we have to do something that they wouldn't like, that's unpleasant or uncomfortable for them, and it would make sense for them to fight back. They seem to have a deep enough seated trust that we never, ever just disregard their feelings, that if we're doing this, it must be really important and necessary. And they will, we had the boy, her first broke off his spur, entire spur, literally trying to bleed out in our arms as we got him into the house. We were able to literally just set him on our lap and hold styptic powder with a palm against his leg while he just stood there. The level of cooperation and trust is absolutely insane. So it feels like people will often try to be very forceful and try to really drill into their head, I'm in charge, because they're afraid that in moments where they need them to be obedient, they won't be otherwise. But it's so much more effective to inspire just that incredibly deep trust and track record than it is to get into any kind of butting of heads or power struggles with them. They're very, very trusting once they have that in place, and they're very willing to go along even if they don't understand. And it really has nothing to do with authority. It has everything to do with security and just a very, very deep faith that their needs are always being considered.
Absolutely. I think that really does, just sum up the reasoning behind why certain things work and certain things don't. And, so many of the common recommendations may work for a time, but ultimately, lead to other issues, other conflict. And a lot of times the two aren't even necessarily connected. someone can see, immediate results that don't necessarily last, but then by the time that the next problem comes up, they associate it with something else when the initial problem still was never identified. Whereas if you put their needs first and you take the time to observe them, get to know them, and find what the real reason is, and always make sure that their needs are prioritized, developing that trust, you can not only fix, but oftentimes avoid all these behavior issues. They'll have their tiffs between each other. Like we said, there's still a flock and there's still that dynamic, but there's never any sort of bad behavior towards us that can't be immediately identified and worked with.
Yeah, ditto with the hens, to the point that we joke with them, about why can't you be this polite to each other? You're clearly capable, because they would never in a million years try to bully us or scold us for picking up a treat from the ground in front of them or any of this nonsense that they sometimes pull with each other. But it's clear that we're in a different social category and they don't feel those same concerns or competitions with us. But really, to put simply, the key to problem solving when it comes to roosters, when it comes to hens, any of these things, it's not as simple as just we're not being violent versus we are. It really entirely comes down to working through their perspective, learning their perspective, and regarding it as valuable information and legitimate. So any of these methods that don't take the time to actually think about what they're experiencing or trying to communicate, that just try to put as quick of a stop to the problem as possible, should be treated with great skepticism. Anytime that we're trying to work through any of these problems, the first step should always be to assume that they have a very good reason for what they're doing. We may not understand it, but we can assume that it's there. And when we do, our perspective broadens and we're going to have access to so many more options, better options for moving forward. It really is a situation where if we fall into this trap of thinking that they're just being dramatic or aggressive or inconvenient or any of these simplified labels, we have cut ourselves off from having any deeper understanding than that because we have tricked ourselves into believing we've already answered the question. So this applies in every area, in every subject. The only time that you are limited is when you believe there is nothing more to learn. So when we approach our flocks, we want to do it with a very open mind. We want to consider all the possible things that might be factoring in, all of their values, all of the things that they might be seeing in the situation. And we want to do our absolute best to take them seriously. When they tell us there's a problem, we should first believe them and then put our full focus on finding ways that we might be able to help, watching for their feedback and guidance the entire time.
And if it appears that it's being directed at us, again, if you have not done anything to make yourself clearly an enemy, don't take it personally. Like we said, we have to search to find what the actual problem is. It could be something you're wearing or something you're holding or the way that you're walking, but it isn't you. And if you can identify what the actual reason is and work with them, they'll recognize that you took the time to find the real reason and didn't take it personally.
Definitely. They will absolutely lash out when they feel like they need help. It can actually just be a sign that they feel like you are the person who can help them, which is in fact a sign of trust, so sometimes it might be something you did without realizing that upset or frightened them. That certainly can happen, but it's not unheard of for them to get rough because they know that we can help and they're very desperate to get that help. They just kind of have some limitations to the ways that they can talk to us. So it's sort of like their version of shouting sometimes, just trying to be very, very emphatic and really communicate the urgency of whatever situation they might be dealing with. So Get rid of this idea, if anyone tries to suggest that they're just simple-minded or defective or broken, really try to push that as far out of your mind as you possibly can. You're not going to have any problems from allowing for other explanations and really thinking deeply into these things. And there's a great deal of benefits. Also, don't be afraid to get a little radical when it comes to caring for your flock. It might feel a bit, I don't know, maybe embarrassing isn't the right word, but, you might feel a little bit self-conscious, being the person, like we are, who sits out in the yard with their chickens 2 hours a day in rain or snow or desert summer temperatures. But it really is so worth it, even just in how much easier it makes all of this. The problems drop off to such an extent, and it becomes such a peaceful and such a fulfilling experience spending time with them. You have that deep sense of connection. You have that ability to feel and understand where they're at just really a moment's notice. And it's a hard thing to put into words, but it's absolutely worth being open to and making some time to pursue. You don't have to necessarily start, putting them in little tutus or anything, or, taking them to Starbucks with you. But don't be afraid to open your heart to them, and don't be afraid to trust the things that they show you and see the best in them. Really, that's going to keep all options on the table, and it's going to empower you when it comes to dealing with anything that might come up.
And if you find that you don't have the time to go out and visit them and get to know them, in person, we've said it again, we said it multiple times recently, but I really urge you to get an outdoor security camera for your chickens area. Even if you aren't home all day, you can pull up the monitor and watch them for a few minutes on your lunch break. And even that will give you so much insight to who they are and how they think and what they like. And you can use that information when you do get around to interacting with them in person. And I bet you they will be so surprised and shocked and appreciative of you knowing them a little bit better and interacting with them in that personable way.
Definitely. And your confidence will increase, which they'll pick up on. They'll sense that you feel calm and equipped to handle the situation, and they'll reflect that calm and, understanding back to you. They're very, very good about doing that. So I do wish that we were able to give a little bit more detail on things like how to actually positively address the flock dynamic issues and social order. That's one of those that is just so individual and it's so nuanced. It really is best to take that sort of thing on a case-by-case basis. So most of what we talked about today is going to be, the solution is looking more deeply, observing flock interactions, ruling out potential causes, whether dietary, environmental, or health-related. But for certain things like the pecking order disputes, the bullying, that kind of thing, never hesitate to reach out to us directly if you're dealing with something like that. It's just quite frankly impossible to give any kind of solution to that without quite a lot more detail, but we're always happy to get that detail and to weigh in on a case-by-case individual basis in those situations. Email, of course, is in the description. If anything we discussed today is something that you're dealing with and maybe you've been relying on some of these methods and you want a new alternative and you're struggling to think of what that might be, same thing, just reach out. We'll be happy to chat with you and try to get things on a positive track that's going to fuel that trust and avoid any of these drawbacks.
Absolutely. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this week's episode. Thank you once again for listening, and we do hope you'll join us again next week. Take care.